Hey guys, before we get started today, just a quick warning that today's episode is not for all audiences. It's a story ultimately of family and faith and love and resiliency, but it has its origins in a crisis, a family tragedy of graphic violence. So if you are somewhere listening with the kids in the car, somewhere like that, I would recommend queuing this one up for a bit later.
Not just for me, but I think it's true for everyone that you can look back at different parts of your life and just see these glimpses of things that you're really passionate about.
Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the Man of Mastery podcast. We've been at it for a few months now, and if you've been here since the beginning, I want to say thank you again. I really appreciate the support and the encouragement and the interest. If you're just now tuning in or getting to know what we're doing here, then thank you as well. I would definitely encourage going back and catching the episodes from the beginning when you have the opportunity. I have had the pleasure and honor to speak with some incredible guests along the way so far. This week's guest and story are no exception. In fact, it raises the bar again on intensity with just an amazing story. As a bit of a spoiler alert, there's a lot of depth to this one, and I broke it into this week's episode and the conclusion in a second half next week. So 2 reasons I chose to do it this way. So one was going into this interview, I promised my guests that I would take this story and do my absolute best to give it justice. It's an emotional one, and one that in that sense I feel is best just portrayed as a conversation that flows and a story that flows, not something to be chopped apart in the editing process. The second reason is that as I go into each of these episodes lately, what I've been trying to do is share a bit more of my takeaways, what I think are actionable items, and what I think you can learn from the subject matter. And to that end, today's episode relates directly back to a guest and a story from episode 8, Chief Instructor C.J. Kirk, who shared a story about a traumatic experience in his life and his belief that negative events in our lives lead directly to equal and opposite positive events and opportunities. This story absolutely demonstrates and embodies that philosophy. So I would keep that in mind as you listen to this story that is one ultimately of incredible resilience. And even as we go through this crisis and tragedy portion of the story in the background, you can hear in our guest the excitement in her voice and the purpose and the passion and the alignment of values as she's gone through and found now a career path that really is sort of her calling and comes as an evolution of what she's about to describe. Hey, today I'm really pleased and excited to welcome a guest that I've been waiting to have on for a while. This is a truly powerful story about a lot of recurring themes here on resilience, on relationship, on mindset. Today I have Meredith Kirk, who is a former professional ballerina, currently a Krav Maga instructor, helps run Krav Maga Houston, teaches Kokoro yoga, meditation instructor, photographer, videographer, marketing. Meredith, welcome. What else did I miss?
Hi, Philip. Thanks for having me, Michael. I'm excited to be here. I would just say I'm a jack of all trades, but a master of none. So I don't know. I'm sure there's lots of other things on there you could add to the list, but I don't know how relevant they would totally be.
Fair enough. All I know, or think I know, is you're not Meredith Kirk, the LPGA professional golfer coach.
That's correct. I've actually never been golfing in my life, so I can imagine I don't have a career as a professional golfer at all.
All right. We'll scratch that one off. That might be the one thing you don't do. Maybe just professional badass is the umbrella title. But one of the really cool things that I've gotten to know about you a little bit in my being a student of your coaching over the last couple of years is you had some earlier careers and you've made some changes to really, I think, follow your gifts and your passions and maybe towards your purpose.
Yeah, I have had quite the journey, you would say. You mentioned in the beginning, I did have some experience pursuing classical ballet as a career. And I decided I didn't want to pursue that any further. It was, typically it's something that's very short-lived, and I'm a planner. So the idea of retiring in my 30s and having nothing to fall back on kind of freaked me out. So I decided to finish school. Yeah, I decided to finish up my college degree. And while I was doing that, I was working full-time in trade compliance, actually. And eventually that transitioned into a job working in oil and gas, which most people in Houston, you're either in medicine or oil and gas. So I ended up in oil and gas. And I did that. I was in that field for about 4 years. And in that time, I was also training as a student here at Krav Maga Houston. And I loved the training. I was here all the time, early morning, back in the evening. My schedule at the time, I had a week on, and we were on call that whole week, and then I would have a week off. And so my week off, I would be here for every single class that I could possibly come to. And I think James was like, "Oh, great, she's here again," But I absolutely loved it. And eventually I started training in this advanced training program with the chief instructor, CJ Kirk, who you actually had on your show a few weeks back, or a month or so ago. And through that process, I got to know him. And within a few months, he was offering me a job to work for the school full-time in marketing and business development, and which I had no experience in. And I thought, "You're crazy. I don't know how to do any of that. It's not a good fit." And he was like, No, it is. Just trust me. And ultimately, I loved Krav, and I didn't love what I was doing at my other job. It was more of a means to an end, but really not fulfilling. So I left, and I started working here, and eventually went through the instructor training and all the certification process, which I'm still going through that as well. And so that's how I've ended up at Krav Maga. So I went from classical ballet to oil and gas to Krav Maga. So it's very different career paths.
That seems, very typical career path. Yeah. In fact, I remember you mentioning at one point being at that oil and gas company, and on a bio break or something, and you're there in the bathroom practicing Krav fighting stance or something in front of the mirror, and people are walking in going, what's going on? So that's probably like a cue for yourself that maybe that's not your ultimate calling, and something's steering you another direction.
Yeah, I think it's not just for me, but I think it's true for everyone, that you can look back at different parts of your life and just see these glimpses of things that you're really passionate about. And there are glimpses from even further back that I realized I really loved teaching, and I never thought that would culminate to teaching Krav Maga. And then, instances like that where I would be in the bathroom, I'd be working on my fighting stance, the position of my arms, and the movement of my feet, working on pivots and crow hops, and people would walk in, and I'd just be like, "Hey there," and then keep going, So there's those glimpses kind of all throughout my life that have pointed to where I am now, which is really cool to see that kind of come to fulfillment now.
Yeah, it makes so much more sense in hindsight. Although it sounds like CJ had a bit of foresight or a bit of vision to get you into the role you're in now, and it was great to have him on. That was an amazing episode. We talked about a number of things, including how Krav Maga has opened doors way beyond the literal realm of self-defense for him and for other people, and clearly that applies to you. One of the things that CJ shared when he was on was what brought him to Krav Maga, a violent event. He was robbed or held up at gunpoint, and he talked about how things in life that are such negative events can, if you're open or do or should, end up in equal or opposite or even more so positive outcomes. Mm-hmm. And that's a place I think we can dive into with you. You have a story that is terrible and beautiful and powerful, something really tough that occurred young in your life. So could we delve into that for a few minutes and talk about what happened and where? Well, one of the things I'm in this mastery journey for me is around, for me as a father, thinking about parenthood, fatherhood, trying to be the best father I can. And you have two very interesting father relationships. So what happened with your biological father?
Yeah, so that's really, I guess, where this whole story and journey of me eventually coming into Krav starts as well. And, it really goes back to early in my childhood. And, I didn't have a very traditional growing up. My parents didn't have a very good relationship. There's a lot of tension. My dad wasn't very present in my life, my biological father. And over time, I just began to notice their relationship change a lot more. He became a lot angrier, a lot more controlling. And at this point, I was, maybe 10, 11 years old. And there came a point around that time that the change in him was so significant that you just knew, I just knew in my heart that something was going to happen. He became very verbally abusive. Again, just very angry. Wasn't afraid to take that anger out on anyone. My mom was typically the one that took the brunt of that. We were more kind of collateral damage, myself and my brother and my sisters. But he just had no control. And he had come home one night from work in a fit. At this point, I was about 12 years old. And
Meredith, you have siblings. You're the youngest of six, I think you've said?
Yeah, the youngest of six. So three of us at the time were still living at the house, living at home with my parents. And, he had come home from work one evening, just in this fit of rage, screaming about how much he hated my mother and how awful she was, and that, he wanted to take a knife and cut her throat. And,
oh my gosh,
as a 12-year-old hearing this, it shocks you. Like there's no frame of reference for any of that in my life, even any of the anger that had happened before. And so my sister and I, we called the police. We were really afraid. We didn't know what to do. My mom hadn't come home yet at this time. And so the police came over and they waited until my mom got back from work. And they tried to talk to him and kind of de-escalate the situation. And they said, I think it's better if you don't stay here tonight. Why don't y'all pack bags, find somewhere to go? And my grandmother lived right around the corner. So, we all packed a little bag and went to her house and stayed the night. And the next morning, we got up to go back to the house. My mother needed a few more things to get ready for work. And at this point, it was, maybe 9 or so in the morning. And typically, my biological father, he would have been gone from work, usually around 6 a.m. And he was still home. And there was just this, like this cloud and this intense, dark energy when we came to the house. And it was so different than anything I had ever felt before, even more intense than the night before.
Wow.
When he had come home. And I just had this feeling that this was the day that something was going to happen. And so I positioned myself by the phone because I just thought I'm going to have to call 911. I just know that something's going to happen. And sure enough, my mother was coming out of the bedroom. And at that point, he had been sitting on the bed. He got off the bed and he grabbed her arm and pulled her back into the room and started stabbing her.
Oh my gosh.
I immediately tried to call 911, and he had done something to the phone line, so none of the phones in the house worked. And, we had cell phones, but it wasn't like you have them now on you all the time. My sister had to go find it somewhere in the house. And so I just threw the phone down and I run to the kitchen to get a knife. And I started to go back into their bedroom to just do whatever I could to try to stop them. And my grandmother had come over with us that morning, and she saw me with the knife. And I think ultimately she didn't want me bearing the responsibility of having to do that to my own father.
Right.
And so she took the knife from me. And when that happened, he turned and he started stabbing her. And so it was just this moment of feeling so helpless.
Sure.
Feeling like nothing I did was really affecting anything. Try kicking and screaming and grabbing, like nothing seemed to work. Everything was ineffective. And, eventually someone was able to call for help, and the police came, and they made us leave the house while they tried to take my mother away from him. At that point, he just had the knife at her throat while they were trying to de-escalate the situation, and she was trying to hold his hands away, and we were just escorted out, and eventually, went through the courts and had to testify against him, and he was sentenced for both crimes against my mother and my grandmother, and that moment just really shaped the trajectory of my whole life.
Right.
And
ultimately, how could it not? And it's you and two of your siblings not only witnessing this, but you were right in the thick of it.
Yeah, and you just never imagine that something that horrible can happen to you. We talk a lot in class about people saying, "Oh, well, statistically, that probably won't happen to me," and I love when Trey brings that up in seminars, because it's like, well, what happens when the statistics don't matter and you're the one that's chosen?
Right.
Because, when for whatever reason this happens in your life, you can't rely on statistics to be the thing that saves you. You have to be prepared for that reality, which is one reason why training in self-defense is so important.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately is, going through this, everything in my life was now colored by this idea that I can't trust anyone. Any people that we knew that I had expected to support my mother and my siblings and I through the process really just abandoned our family. We lost a lot of the friends we had. Those same people testified as character witnesses for my father in court. And, it was like every part of my reality was shattered. My family, any friendship, any community, all of it was gone. And I was a very angry person after that for many, many years, very jaded.
Understandably. And did your mother and your grandmother, they both survived?
They both survived. My mother is still here, and my grandma actually passed away about a year later. It was before we actually went to trial. She passed for an unrelated issue that was actually brought to light because of what had happened to her. So we were actually probably given more time with her had that happened than if it hadn't. So again, it's like you said, finding the positives in those really terrible things. That was one.
And you had to make this choice, and you're testifying in court. And meanwhile, friendships, like you mentioned, you guys as a family were regular churchgoers. Folks from the church community were picking sides as well, and rallied on your father's side, who'd committed this crazy, criminal, heinous act. And all of a sudden, sort of you and your siblings and your mom were alone in all this.
Yeah, it became a very solitary lifestyle. We were also homeschooled, so that certainly didn't help. That kind of feeling of confinement and isolation. And so my answer to dealing with all of that was, I'm just going to throw myself into whatever it is that I'm doing, and that's just going to be all that I focus on. Yeah. And so a few years after that actually became ballet, and that was my whole focus. That's all I did. Eventually, then it was school. That was it. That was all I did. And I relied on this anger and this judgment of other people to be this, ultimately, it was just this self-defeating behavior, right? I could never let anyone get close because I was so afraid of that betrayal again. And anger was reliable. Anger helped me justify why someone couldn't be a part of my life. It seemed like a good tool because it was protecting me, but ultimately it was just shielding me from actually building meaningful relationships and having community, which is really what I needed.
And you see a lot of people use anger to drive a lot of things, and maybe maybe it's sort of a fast burning, sort of short burst fuel, but probably not sustainable. You see it in athletes that use anger to drive performance, but again, not sustainable over the long haul. To kind of put some things in perspective, if I've got some of your time frame right, so sort of 12 years old-ish, I think you graduated when you were around 16, and then just threw yourself into the other things you were just describing. So, in the big picture of life, these are really just a few short years later that you're still carrying this trauma. What did it do to the relationship between you and your siblings, you and your mom, the siblings who were there during that, and the ones who weren't? Was that tough as well?
Yeah, it certainly impacted those relationships. I think ultimately there was this fear that we for some reason couldn't trust each other. Some of the relationships were impacted more severely than others. Some are still working through healing processes now, and some, we're still open and family very much. But it certainly made those relationships more difficult. I know for me, I felt like I couldn't turn to any of them, even though they had been through the same thing. They had seen the same thing. They had experienced it. I was really afraid of what that vulnerability would mean if they, for some reason, betrayed me too,
Right.
And so, I had no reason in my relationship with them personally to believe that, only based on the experiences I had with other people in my life that had betrayed me. So, and again, that just like this lack of awareness of, we're more rather just painting with a very broad brush from one experience and allowing that to color everything else in my life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I easily can see how those feelings of helplessness and fear of further betrayal and that anger could just permeate everything. And I think you've even said that even as you started to throw yourself at excelling at different things, ballet, and then school and work at the same time, even I think driving yourself to the point of physically becoming sick from everything you were putting on yourself, you still had this feeling of, so I'm going to guess you excelled at whatever you threw yourself at, but you were still walking around feeling broken, not good enough.
Yeah, that haunted me constantly. And it's really something that I think in the last, 3 to 5 years that I've really been able to work through. And it's crippling, and then it created within me at least this mindset of complete independence, complete sovereignty. Everything I have to do by myself, which is another thing that fueled my pursuit of, I'm only going to focus on this and I'm going to be all in all the time. So it was just all these little things making these massive changes to my mindset and the way that I was approaching circumstances and other people in my life.
And then, I just sitting here thinking, like, I think you are the female David Goggins, now that I think about it.
Wow, that's such a big compliment. I don't know if I am actually worthy of that, but
I definitely mean it as a compliment. What brought you, you would think that those tragic events with your father would maybe be the low spot, but it almost sounds like you kind of hit bottom some years after that with everything you were just piling on yourself and driving yourself into worthy pursuits on the surface with a career in ballet and then a professional career and finishing your schooling at the same time. But you bottomed out physically, probably emotionally, and something eventually brought you to Krav Maga.
Yeah. So, I think the best way that I learned to deal with my emotions growing up, and I say the best way, like in a very ironic way, but let me be clear about that, was just to not deal with them at all. So it was very much, you just shove them down, you just tighten that seal as much as you can, and you don't let them out. And so eventually, you mentioned, I know you've heard a lot of my story before, it took time for those things to start to bubble up and you reach a point that was even lower. Even though my circumstances may not have been as tragic as they were when I was 12, reaching the point where I'm now dealing with this overwhelming tsunami of emotions that I haven't dealt with for, 10 to 12 years are now creeping up on me. And it really did happen my last year of college. So I had, this is when I was working in international trade compliance and I was pursuing my degree. I had taken a year off from school when I danced, and then I had taken a year off after I decided to return to college just to work to be able to fund it. Because again, I was doing everything alone, and that was my whole mindset was I don't need any help.
Right.
And so I'm getting back into school, and my thought process going into it was, man, I just wasted 2 years, and I could be done already. So instead of taking 2 years to finish my degree, I'm just going to jam pack it into one. So I was taking, this was such a terrible idea. I was taking 8 classes a semester and pursuing my business degree. I was doing those online through Liberty University. And then I was working full time, and I was an hourly employee. So I tried to work as much overtime as I could because that helped me pay for school. So, I would work, 50 to 60 hours a week and then come home and have a workload of 8 college courses to manage. And my last semester, or I guess it was the semester before my last, it was the spring. And my last semester was summer. I physically just I was just running myself into the ground. I was barely sleeping, maybe an hour to 2 hours a night. I didn't have a huge excess in my budget, so I was eating a lot of food that wasn't very good for me, a lot of ramen and a lot of rice. That was pretty much it. That's all that sustained me. And I wasn't taking care of myself mentally, physically, emotionally, and I started to feel really sick. And I just kind of, again, going back to what I know, just ignore the feelings, ignore whatever's happening, and eventually it'll go away.
Just push through.
And yeah, I just pushed through, and it never went away. It started to get worse, and it got to the point where I'm, sitting at work, I'm working on a project, and then all of a sudden I would just completely forget what I was working on. I had no idea. I'm like, what am I even doing at work today? I don't know. And it started off as little things, and I was like, just because I'm not sleeping. I always found a way to justify it. And then the most glaring time, and then through all this, I was having these serious headaches, terrible migraines. I would have these bouts of nausea and vomiting, and again, I just chalked it up to like, it's just because I'm not sleeping. It's because I'm not sleeping. It's just because I'm so stressed out. Mm-hmm. And one day I was driving home from work, driving down the Beltway, and I just started bawling, and I realized I had no idea where I lived. Like I knew that I was on the Beltway, and I recognized these street signs, but I had no idea how it related to me and where I needed to go, or where I lived. And I'm just driving and driving. I'm like, something's going to look familiar. Something's going to look familiar. And I'm just crying, and I'm just remembering that, I'm not remembering that I have no idea where I live. Yeah. And eventually my phone kind of buzzed. Somebody had sent me an email for work or something. And that's when I had the idea, like, home is on my GPS on my phone. So I used my GPS to get home. And I was like, I'll just lay down for a few hours. Cause I still didn't want to go and get looked at the hospital. Right. I didn't want to do any of that because that would have been an interruption to all the work that I needed to get done, So again, I just tried to ignore it. I went home and I laid down for about, it was a few hours. And then I got up and was like, I have to do school. I've got to do some work. And so I start working on school, and it just still wasn't getting any better. And finally around, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, I drove myself to the emergency room. I purposely drove. I think I passed 3 on the way there, but I purposely drove to the one next to my office because I thought they could just give me some medicine and then I could go into work the next day. Like I didn't want to miss work and not get paid and not be able to, pay for school, and saving sick days for when I had midterms and finals. And, I was just trying to bide my time however I could, and ended up being admitted for having meningitis. And I was in the hospital for about a week. I had to go on medical leave from work for over a month, and that ended up recurring again a couple months later because, again, I was just pushing myself. I didn't change my school schedule. I was still trying to maintain my classes at the time, and I was in the hospital, and I was on bed rest. And so that was really when all of that began to shift, and I was noticing that I really need to do something about this because if I don't, I'm probably going to die.
And you were saving your sick days for when you were really sick. Meanwhile, you're running around with meningitis.
Well, I was saving my sick days for when I had to take final exams, and but to my office, I would have been really sick. So that just kind of continued, and I ended up graduating in the summer. Eventually, slowly started to make my way back into the workplace, and I was actually still on my second bed rest. I had thought that it had been a recurring issue, and I had to go back in and I think they did like 3 more spinal taps. I've never had so many spinal taps in my life. I don't wish them on anyone. But they had to go do all these other tests, and they were like, this is an issue again. You need to stay home, don't do anything. And they're like, you're not contagious. So I was like, great, I'm going to start Krav Maga.
Perfect.
I just had this cabin fever. I had all this time now because I wasn't in school anymore. And I had heard about Krav when I was maybe 15 or 16 years old. And I remember seeing it on this Discovery Channel show. I don't know, Fight World, or I don't quite remember the name of it. And I just remembered watching and seeing this Israeli woman training these American fighters, and the things they were doing were so real, and it was so intense, and the things she was saying made so much sense to me about what I had known, what I had seen, and what I knew about violence. And I just kind of tucked that away into the back of my mind. And so now here I am with all this time on my hands. And I was like, you know what? I drive by this place on 59 and Kirby all the time.
Yep.
I'm going to go in and start training. And so my first class, I came in, we started with jumping jacks just in the warm up, and I almost passed out. You know, poor James is carrying me out, lays me on the bench in the lobby, and, you know, making sure I'm okay, getting me water, getting me food, you know, checking with me constantly. And the next day he called me to check in, make sure I'm all right. I'm like, yeah, I'm doing great. I want to come back tonight. And he was like, I don't think that's a good idea, you know. And at that point I hadn't told him any of my health issues anyway, which is terrible. And definitely should do that. But, you know, I was like, he was like, don't come back tonight. I think it's probably a little soon. You know, you're welcome to come back in, but let's make sure that you're healthy before that happens.
Yeah.
And so I went back the following Monday, a week later, and I signed a 1-year contract, and I haven't looked back.
Yeah, of course, because like everything else you do, you're just going to throw yourself into it full on.
Exactly.
I think James, who manages the gym, must get so many of those. I think one of his first questions is, hey, what brought you in? And my answer was exactly the same thing. Well, I've been driving by the sign and the place here on 59 Kirby for years, and then something finally drew me to walk in.
Right.
But I can just imagine you're walking around with the history you got and this sense of helplessness and the lack of ability to do anything when you did find yourself in that situation, and you had seen something that appeared to work in the real world. Now you've signed yourself up for a year of it. And you just mentioned earlier that as you threw yourself at Krav Maga, you quickly ended up in the advanced training. And that's how you, I think, really got to spend some time with CJ Kirk.
Yeah, I started that program about a year after I had been in classes here. I had done a couple belt tests. And the nature of the training is exactly what it sounds like. It's advanced. And so we're taking these gross motor skills of a single technique and kind of tracing it through the entire system. And so very quickly, we took what is a very simple punch defense and began to work a knife defense. And, you know, it was strange to me because I had done several seminars. I had trained a knife in like level 2-3 classes before, and I had never had any real issues addressing that in class. But for whatever reason, maybe it was just the level of repetition and just being in there for an hour and a half, working the same knife defense over and over and over again. I'm not entirely sure what specifically it was that began to trigger that, but I started to have a very large emotional response, and it was very difficult for me to get through class. You know, it was like having these flashbacks and this you know, almost PTSD type of stuff where you're back in that moment and you're feeling that helplessness. You're seeing all that event again in your mind, and I would just break down. And I didn't want to be that person that let that overcome them and let that guide everything I was doing.
Wow. Okay, let's stop there and pause for this week. That story, if you're anything like me, the first time I heard it, it's just absolutely flooring. In fact, in training at the gym, I had no idea. You would never know. Coach Meredith is such a gregarious, positive, supportive coach to her students. I remember one year around the holiday times making a comment, you know, hey, happy holidays. Are you going anywhere or doing anything? And what in hindsight was this massive understatement. In response, she said, well, I'm not super close with my family. So the first time I actually heard this story was just recently on a podcast interview that Meredith did with, I think, her church or her minister. So again, I hope we do the story justice here, and I thank her for the bravery to be willing to share it with people. Today you heard about the resulting pain and anger and helplessness that were a product of this tragedy as a child. But then you also hear the independence and the strength and maybe the stoicism around those events until it all came flooding back in this moment in training at the gym. Before we wrap for today, here are a couple of audio clips previewing the second half conclusion next week, where Meredith talks about just starting to take for granted there were going to be certain voids in her life. And she talks about the role that Chief Kirk plays. And she talks about how all this came to be.
I rejected it, and then I accepted it too. It's like, well, there's certain things I'm never going to get to experience. I'm never going to get to experience my dad saying, I love you. I'm never going to get to experience a father walking me down the aisle. I'm never going to get to experience those types of things. He just decided that he was going to take this pursuit to be a father to me and be a dad in my life. It shocks me now, even thinking about it. I mean, the only explanation to me is divine intervention. I'm at a point in my life now where I see all of these different sets of events that have taken place, and I just can't believe that all of those things are coincidences.
That's all coming up next week in episode 17. Honestly, it's a tearjerker. At the same time, it's a hugely positive story. You're not going to want to miss it. Next Thursday, see you then.